Alright, so we are going to be mixing a full range of colors on the color wheel. We're going to be talking about different characteristics of color as we go. Here's your color wheel. Hopefully you've downloaded and printed this onto a sheet of watercolor paper. And you should have an empty palette, clean dry palette, with no watercolor residue on it. All these paint marks are acrylic, so they won't come off, but any old watercolor you would want to wash off. A set of watercolors. You want something to dispense your water in. I'm just using a little measuring cup with a spout, but you want something pretty specific. You wouldn't want to just pour it from a cup. You can also just use your brush and dip it in the water. Well, you want something holding a bunch of water. Here's mine. But you can just use like a butter tub or something. Whoops. You can dip your brush in there and scrape it into the cup too, but that just takes a little longer, so I prefer to pour. Anyway, before we start actually mixing colors, we're just going to talk a little bit about basic color theory. So we're going to start by mixing your primary colors, which are red, yellow, and blue. The reason they're called primary colors is because they are the strongest, most important colors in nature. The word primary, means important or first. So red, yellow, and blue are the only colors that exist in nature just as they are, and you can't make them using any other means. But every other color in the world you can mix using those three colors. That's why they're so powerful. After we mix red, blue, and yellow, we're going to use those colors to mix the secondary colors, which are orange, green, and purple. And orange, green, and purple are located directly between the primaries. So orange is right between red and yellow on the color wheel. And if you ever aren't sure how to mix a color, you can use the color wheel as a calculator. For example, red-purple is directly between purple and red. As if the name isn't that obvious, but you kind of get the picture. Let's see what else. So we're going to start by mixing those basic hues. Hue is just the name for color in art. There's three basic characteristics of color we're going to be exploring here. One of them is hue, what the color is. The second thing is saturation of color, and that just means how pure a color is. For example, a really saturated red would be very, very vibrant, like in a ruby or an apple or a bright red rose. A dull red or an unsaturated red would be in like 50-year-old bricks or something else that's really dull red. The third thing would be value. So the value of a color is just how light or dark it is. And we're going to be exploring all three of those things as we're mixing. Something else you're going to need is a test strip. Just a piece of watercolor paper. It can be marked up, whatever. Just a spare piece of watercolor paper for you to test your colors on before you put it on your wheel. This is really important in watercolor because your colors will always appear brighter in the mixing cups than they will on paper. So you always want to test it before you put it on your wheel. And now that I'm looking at this, I'm realizing that you need something to compare your colors to, so hopefully I'll have a color wheel printed out by the time this is actually live. So, to get started, there's a couple ways you can go about this. Depending on how saturated you want your color, you can either start with color or you can start with water. We're going to go for very saturated, bright, intense colors. So we're going to start by putting the color into the cup. So you just open up the tube, squeeze out a little bit, if they're not 50 years old, which these are. I gotta get new watercolors. And then you can add water to it by either dipping and scraping in the cup, or as I mentioned before, my preferred method is just to pour a little bit and stir it up. So because my watercolor is so old and crusty, this isn't working super well, or super fast actually. If you're using colors you just bought, or even within the last like 3 years, they should be very liquid and it'll just mix up really well. But I have a big lump at the bottom of my cup, so I'm just going to keep agitating it and stirring it. It's not that it's going to affect your quality of paint at all, it's just dry, so it takes a while to re-enliven. And as you can see, the color in the cup looks very, very vibrant. Oh, sorry, my hand's in the way. but that's not always the case. So I'm just going to stop and give you a little example. To test your color, scrape it on the side and just put a line on your test strip. See how light that is in value, so it's very deceptive. And that's why it's important to test it. So I'm just going to keep on mixing here. Stirring it up. There's my lump on the side. And I'm going to test it again. Scrape, scrape. So it's getting a little bit more obvious, but I really want my color to be very saturated. And this is a good time to mention, if you're mixing a color and you notice, wow, it's really not getting saturated, I'm going to have to add a bunch more color to get this the color I want. It's a good time to ask yourself how much paint you really need. So I'm only going to be painting in this little rectangle here. I only need like this much paint that's on my brush right now. I don't need this much. So rather than add a ton more paint to get the color saturated the way I want it to be, I'm just going to take a couple brushfuls out. So I'm dipping my brush in the water, or in the color, rinsing it out in my tub, and then drying it on a towel. Oh, I forgot to mention you need a towel or a sponge or something to dry your brush off on. So dip, rinse, scrape. Or you could just take like the tip of a sponge and soak it up or something. The point is you want to get rid of some of it so that the amount of color you need to add is less in order to get the saturation you want. So I'm going to add another huge, or not huge, very hard lump of this red and mix it in, agitating again. Fortunately, not all my watercolors are quite that decrepit. It's just this one had a broken top, so it's allowed air to seep in over time, which has made it dry out. So the texture of the color itself is getting a little soupier now, so I can tell that it's getting to be more of the saturation I want. So I'm going to put a new test on. There we go. Now I'm happy with how saturated that is. Another note, if you test your color and don't scrape your brush, you'll often get a big drip. See that big drip at the bottom, which is deceptive also. It makes you think your color is brighter than it really is. So you want to rinse your brush, dry it off on the towel, and then just touch that drip, and it'll soak up right in. Soak up right into the brush. And if you don't want to wipe it, because if you wipe it, you kind of pull some color off. Not that it matters so much on the test strip. This is just for your information when you're painting. That'll happen. But this right here is your true color, the part at the top of that sample. So now I have a good red, and I'm going to dip my brush in the paint and paint it in. Move this over so you can see it. So to paint it in, you want to have a nice big brush full of color and just kind of go from side to side and smear the color around. It's good to have a nice soft brush with a very fine tip so that you can keep the color contained within your shape. And you want it pretty drippy because it will not only allow your color to be as rich as it's intended, but it will prevent brush strokes from happening or from showing up. When you're done, just tilt the board very, very slightly to one side so all that color falls to one side, and touch that drip, just like you did on your test strip. I'm going to scrape off my brush, or you can just rinse it off if you don't need the color anymore. Touch the towel, soak up all the extra water, and do it again until all of that color, extra color, is absorbed. But again, don't wipe it because you'll end up with a white corner. Touch the towel and touch that corner till the drip is all soaked up. And now our red's painted in. So we're going to do the same thing 1,500 more times, kidding, for the rest of the circle. But before we do, oh no, yeah, that's what we're going to do, sorry. Oh, you know what, no, we already did that, never mind. So now we're going to move on to yellow. So yellow is a little more liquidy than my red, fortunately. And this time I'm not going to add quite as much water because I ended up having to take some out last time. Not that that's the end of the world, just trying to save a step. Make sure you clean and rinse your brush really well, and then do the same thing again. The first color is usually the longest to mix because you're just getting used to the material, and then from there it feels more fluid, pun intended. So let's test out this yellow. It's a little lighter than I want it to be, so once again, not enough color, too much water. So once again, I'm going to get rid of some of it rather than use up color I don't need to use. Soak up a big brush full, rinse it out in the tub, touch the towel. Soak up a big brush full, rinse it out in the tub, touch the towel. And let's add a little more yellow. Something else that can happen, you can see my red is starting to kind of migrate over here into my yellow, so before that gets too far, I'm just going to stop it. Otherwise I end up with orange. So now that's looking pretty thick, so I'm going to test it again, and now I have a sample I'm happy with. So I'm going to grab that and paint in my yellow circle. Nice big brush full, and just paint it in nice and drippy, using the tip of the brush to get those edges nice and clean. Then rinse, touch my towel, and tilt the board to one direction, soak up my drip. Painting these in is also just good practice for getting used to how the material behaves for when you're doing a real painting. Alright, let's move on to blue. So we're going to use this phthalo blue. By the way, this was brilliant red we used and medium yellow. Blue is actually the strongest color there is. Although blue, any color comes in various levels of strength. But you usually need much less blue than you think you do. So this time I'm just going to add water by the brushful because the last couple times I've overdone it with the water. And now I'm going to mix that up. Scrape, scrape, scrape on the side. Let's test that color. Pretty good, but I could go stronger. I'm going to see if there's any unresolved lumps at the bottom. Nope, I mixed it all the way. Oh wait, there's some on the side here. Let me try that again. Rinse, touch. Let me soak up that drip. I'm going to add a little bit more. So just scraping it off on the side of the cup. I'm a big fan of bright saturated colors. You may not be. It's fine if you want yours a little lighter. But when you get to painting a picture, you're going to want to be able to match whatever color you see, be they bright or not. So let's try this out. Oh, it looks exactly the same, huh? Let's see. Any lumps in the bottom there? No. Let me scrape a little less this time. There we go. There's my brightness. I'm going to touch that drip to get rid of it. I guess I was pretty saturated to begin with. I was just being picky. Look at that. Okay, we're going to go with it. So now we'll paint that in. Get some paint. Fill in this shape over here, bent trapezoid. So when you buy your watercolor brushes, just buy brushes that are labeled for watercolor and you'll be fine. But they're all very soft bristled, generally either very pointy or very flat. There are round ones. There's also specialty brushes. But for right now, a brush like the one I have is usually pretty adequate. Alright, so there we have our primaries. Now we're going to mix secondaries, but we're going to do it using the primary colors. So rather than use orange straight from the tube, we're going to mix yellow and red together. And the reason for that is the more you mix colors together rather than using them straight from the tube, generally the less canned your colors look, or the more authentic or more realistic, I guess for lack of a better word, more nuanced. I'll show you an example of that. Actually, let's do that now. So when you mix two colors together, you generally want to start with the lighter one and add the darker one, because the lighter one is usually weaker. And if you have to add the light to the darker one, it takes longer to mix, and you usually have to use more paint, and it ends up wasting your time and your paint. So it's just easier to add dark to light. That's not always the case, and we'll get into that as it happens. But we're going to be mixing orange, so we're going to start with yellow, which we already have. And you can either add more red from the tube, or you can add red from here. I'm going to start by adding red from here because I know my colors are really saturated, so I don't think the extra water, I have water in both of these already, I don't think that's going to be a real problem. So I'm going to take just a little bit of red to begin with. I dipped my brush in and scraped it, because I can always add more, but you don't want to have to add more yellow if you can avoid it. So I'm just going to mix it up. And wow, look at that. So not very much it took to make orange. Actually, I think I may have gone a little too far. Let's see. Nope, that's a pretty darn good orange. I think I'm going to stick with that. And I will paint that in. Next to the word orange. Coincidence. Whoops. Rinse. Touch my towel. And tilt and soak up my drip. Okay, now we will go on to purple, because I have red and blue. So I'm going to take a little bit of the blue. Remember how I mentioned blue is the strongest color strongest color of the primaries, which are already the strongest colors. So you really don't need much. So let's see what happens when I add just a little bit of blue to that red. That turned dark red really quickly, kind of a brick red almost, so I definitely need more blue. Touch the towel, but not very much. Again, be very conservative with how much blue you add. You'll find out pretty quickly that it doesn't take a lot to make the color you want. So this is so dark I really can't tell what it is, so I'm gonna just test it. Rinse, touch, and it's looking purple, but still a little more on the reddish side, so I'm gonna add just a bit more blue. Get all the water out. Scrape. Oops, I didn't have much on there. Oops, I just broke one of my own rules. So another thing I haven't mentioned is when you test a color, you want to test in a clean spot. You see how I just did that twice in the same place? That will sometimes make your color appear darker than it is, not always, but it's just best to test in a totally clean spot. Get rid of all that drip, and I feel like that's a pretty good purple, so I'm going to take that and paint it into the purple part. Rinse, touch my towel, tilt, touch my drip. Do that again, because my drip was too big there, so it wouldn't soak up into one brush. Alright, now we just have green left of the secondary colors. I don't have yellow anymore because I made orange out of it, so I'm going to start from scratch in a new, oh, there's some crumb in there, in a new cup. Start with yellow. And I'm going to add water. Oops, I forgot to clean my brush. Wow, that's bad. So my water hasn't touched the paint yet, so I can just take a towel and soak that up. Oh, that's awesome. What a fun characteristic of watercolor. So let me rinse my brush this time. Now I'm going to put water in. There we go. So just a couple brushfuls, and then I'm going to mix the yellow in. Scrape. Let's test. That's pretty bright. Another thing to mention here is that as you're mixing anything except a color straight from the tube, if you get to this point and you test it and it's not exactly as saturated as you want, don't worry about it too much, because you're going to be adding something else to it anyway. I'm going to be adding blue to this, and that has water in it, so it may become too diluted anyway, so I'm not going to worry about the saturation until I achieve the color I want. For the most part, it's definitely a rule you can break, but just something I tend to do. So I'm going to get just the teeniest bit of blue on the tip of my brush, mix it into the yellow, and that was already, oh maybe not, I was going to say it was already too much. I thought it was going to be too blue, but I think that's a pretty appropriate green. So I'm going to scrape it off. Oop, I did it again. Don't test twice in the same place, Diane. Rinse, touch, soak up the drip. Actually, it seems a little yellowy green now that it's on the test strip, so I'm going to add just a dot more blue. Scrape. There's some stripe of varnish on here or something. Rinse, touch. Looks pretty similar. I'm going to add just another dot, teeny little dot. More. Touch the drip. A little bit more. So I'm being very conservative here. I could add more blue and, you know, have to backtrack and put more yellow, but I'm trying to avoid that. Ha! Although I may have just done exactly that thing. Scrape, test, rinse, touch. No, I think I got it. Okay, so now I'm going to paint in the green. A little more paint. Rinse, touch, soak up the drip. So as you can see, all of these colors are not touching one another. There's a space between each one, which in watercolor is really important. You want to paint section by section like that. If you're ever painting next to something that's wet, you always want to blow dry that first, unless you want them to bleed together. But they will bleed together regardless of what you want, so make sure it's dry if you don't want them to bleed together. So now is going to be a good time to stop and blow dry our wheels before we mix the tertiary colors.